Good afternoon to everyone in Europe. Good morning in Latin America. Thank you all for joining. We are today very happy to launch our book, which is the result, I think, of a huge collaboration between many of the faces that you see here and many that you are not seeing at the moment. We didn't have the time to invite everyone to share their experience, but this is part of a great collaboration. My name is Daniel Oviedo. I am a lecturer at the Development Planning Unit, which is the institution organizing the event, and I'm one of the editors of the book. I'm going to share my screen now and introduce the agenda for today. We have a fantastic roster of speakers, including my two co-editors, Ana Marcela Ardila and Natalia Villamizar. We have three speakers who have contributed with chapters for the book, which are Diego Hernandez, Gabriela Sicifaria, Frederick Fleischer. We also have with us some fantastic academics, Professor Stephen Eason, who is one of the editors of the book series to which our volume belongs, Professor Julio Davila and Professor Lake Zagaris, who are all academics well recognized by many of you in issues around transport equity in Latin America. So without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen if I can ever find it. So I can present the slides. Here we are. So I will be working more as a master of ceremonies for our book launch of Urban Mobility and Social Equity in Latin America, Evidence, Concepts, and Methods. And before I start, I just wanted to highlight again that this is part of a collaboration which finds its place in the International Network for Transport and Accessibility in Low-Income Communities, in particular the Latin American chapter, Untitled Chapter. And this started for a long time ago. We had a conference in Barcelona, the LASA conference, I think 3-4 years ago, when we started sharing experiences and we came up with the idea of this book, which today is printed and many of us have it in our hands. We have many friends from across the Americas, across the global North and the global South, who have contributed to this book. I wanted to give special thanks to Professor Karen Lucas, who's also the director of the Interlink network at the global level, and that has supported this initiative of Interlink LAC and the book as a whole. And to all the authors, all the contributors, many of who are joining today, thank you for your contributions. And I hope that this is only the first of many other collaborations that we do as part of the network, but also as part of this effort of introducing more research in the Latin American context about transport equity and urban mobility. So today's agenda, I'm Daniel Oviedo again. I already welcome you all. I'm going to give the word now to Professor Stephen Eason, who's going to introduce the Emerald Book Series. Then we have Ana Marcela Ardila, who is going to introduce the book itself. We're moving then to quick presentations from Diego, Gabriela, and Frederic, who are going to speak about their chapters. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Lake Zagaris, Julio Davila, and Natalia Villamizar. For everyone that is joining us and wants to listen to the webinar in another language, at the bottom of your screens, you're going to find the interpretation function, and you can select channels in Spanish or in Portuguese if that's your preferred language. If not, we can stay in the English channel. So up to you, Steve.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm very pleased to be involved in this book launch. I'm one of the series editors, the two more, Maria, who may well be here today, and also John. The book series started back in 2012, part of an Emerald series. A little bit there about the series itself, based on original research, but with an emphasis on transport and sustainability in the main. The book that we're talking about today, the Urban Mobility and Social Equity in Latin America, fits all of those points, which are the key objectives of the series: to look at key challenges, to be of an international perspective, to bring together international academic and professionals, to stimulate debate, and to cover all modes. As you can see, there's a web link there. So if you want to have a look at the series and where the urban mobility book fits into it, then you can. The second slide simply, if you want to move it on, Daniel, simply gives a listing of the book so far, and it's varied. So ranging from cycling through to parking, sustainable logistics, walking, later life travel, and of course the book here today, urban mobility and social equity in Latin America. So I'm pleased to be involved in the launch. Thanks, Daniel, Natalia, and Anna for taking on the mantle, not insubstantial mantle, of putting together a book. It takes a lot of time and effort, but you're there, you've reached the end, and I have a copy on my desk to prove it. So that's absolutely brilliant. And just to say that I had a word with Emerald, and there is a discount for those that would like to buy a copy of the book. And there we go. Always have to market these things. And there's a code that you need to use if that's something you would like to do. So it's at the bottom of the slide. So I'm looking forward to it. It should be a great time this afternoon.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks. Now let's move into our main content. So I want to invite now Anna to give an overview of the book in itself. Anna is going to be speaking in Spanish. So if you want, we're going to hear the translation in the English channel. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong. So those of you who are currently listening in Spanish can listen to the main channel now. Ana.
Muchas gracias, Daniel, por la invitación. Quiero agradecer también a DPU y a UCL y a Emerald por la publicación del libro y por la realización de este evento tan importante para la ciencia sobre estudios de transporte y equidad urbana. El próximo, Daniel. Next. Daniel. Quiero presentar la estructura del libro. En primer lugar, voy a hacer una caracterización de los autores, posteriormente una presentación de cuál es la estructura del libro y por último las contribuciones de cada una de las secciones de este trabajo. Siguiente. En primer lugar, quiero hablar sobre la distribución espacial de las publicaciones. Es importante destacar el hecho de que muchas ciudades de América Latina fueron incluidas y particularmente quiero hablar de tres casos importantes. El hecho de que fueron incluidas por primera vez, digamos, pocas veces son incluidas publicaciones sobre el Caribe y hoy tenemos en este libro una publicación sobre San Juan de Puerto Rico, que es una importante ciudad del Caribe y creemos que es importante incluir esta región. También es importante el hecho de que incluimos los hispanos en Estados Unidos, una población que cada vez gana más importancia en este país y que son relevantes sus prácticas de movilidad también muy parecidas a muchas de las prácticas de los latinoamericanos que viven en las ciudades latinoamericanas. Y el tercer elemento es el hecho de que hay una concentración importante de estudios en Belo Horizonte, Santiago y Bogotá, y particularmente el caso de Bogotá y Belo Horizonte no es gratuito y tiene que ver exactamente con que estas dos ciudades son puntos importantes de la red de investigaciones de Interlink y que tiene que ver con el papel muy importante del Centro de Desarrollo Sostenible de América Latina, con la Universidad de los Andes, la Universidad Nacional y también la Universidad de Minas Gerais, el Centro de Estudios Urbanos. Siguiente, Daniel. Siguiente. Bueno, sobre las características de los autores de esta publicación, elaboré aquí una nube de palabras con las biografías de los autores y varias cosas fueron bien significativas de ese análisis. Una primera cosa es que hay un esfuerzo de integración entre planeadores urbanos, ingenieros y personas de las ciencias sociales en la construcción de este campo de conocimiento y en la realización de estos estudios. El otro elemento importante es que hay una presencia muy grande de jóvenes investigadores, personas que están comenzando su carrera y que habla de la juventud, de la capacidad de este campo de crecer y de expansión. También es importante reconocer que de los 19 autores que participan de este libro, 14 somos mujeres. Y eso habla de la participación grande de las mujeres en la construcción de conocimiento sobre esta área, una área que era tradicionalmente asociada a los hombres, un espacio más masculino. El otro elemento interesante es que la mayoría de las personas pertenece al campo académico, muchos de ellos, de las personas son profesores, docentes, pero encontramos también personas con mucha experiencia en la construcción de políticas urbanas, de políticas públicas, mayoría de las personas ligadas a actividades de consultoría, actividades de planeación. Este grupo de personas también presenta una diversidad muy grande de métodos y teorías que les permite mostrar las relaciones entre las dimensiones espaciales y sociales del transporte y la movilidad, y de esta manera superar visiones tradicionales del transporte muy asociadas a estudios de carácter cuantitativo. Siguiente, Daniel, por favor. Daniel, siguiente. La estructura del libro es la siguiente. La primera sección tiene que ver con las dimensiones estructurales de la accesibilidad, la segunda con el papel del transporte activo en la accesibilidad local y la tercera con el papel de algunas identidades emergentes en la construcción de nuestras ciudades y los sistemas de movilidad. Siguiente, Daniel. Siguiente. Bueno, voy a comenzar con las contribuciones del grupo que trabaja sobre las dimensiones estructurales de la movilidad. En este grupo contamos con trabajos elaborados por Daniel Oviedo, Luis Guzmán, Diego Hernández y Daniela de los Santos, Gabriela Sichiparía, Frederick Fleischer y Ivette Sepúlveda. En este trabajo, estos autores discuten las formas tradicionales de investigación sobre transporte vinculadas fundamentalmente al análisis de infraestructuras viarias y a las ofertas de sistemas de transporte público a través fundamentalmente de la construcción de índices de accesibilidad. Estos autores quieren colocar a las personas en el centro de la discusión y para eso analizan sus prácticas y sus posiciones en las estructuras urbanas. Para eso, ellos reconocen la diversidad de prácticas urbanas en oposición a una visión tradicional que considera fundamentalmente las prácticas de hombres adultos, saludables, empleados que trabajan en empleos formales y se desplazan de la casa al trabajo, para construir una visión de esas prácticas mucho más compleja, en donde se evidencian diversidades de orden, por ejemplo, de características socioeconómicas, por ejemplo, como su vinculación a los mercados formales e informales del empleo, o como sus diferenciales de ingresos, o como la forma como se organiza la ciudad y los tejidos urbanos en términos de las posiciones de las personas en sociedades altamente segregadas, como el caso de las sociedades latinoamericanas. Este grupo de trabajo también analiza el papel de las estructuras demográficas en las ciudades, especialmente el género, que es un campo que cada vez más crece en los estudios de transporte y movilidad y que dan cuenta de cómo las mujeres tenemos accesos diferenciados a los espacios urbanos y a los bienes y servicios. Estas investigaciones buscan entender cómo los papeles, los diferenciales en papeles productivos y reproductivos se traducen en prácticas de movilidad inequitativas en muchos casos. Particularmente, estos autores muestran la diversidad de perspectivas de las mujeres, especialmente vinculadas a las movilidades del cuidado. Es importante ver cómo ellos destacan el papel de la diversidad de los motivos de viaje, los diferentes trayectos que las mujeres utilizan y la dependencia de las mujeres de los sistemas públicos y de los espacios públicos de movilidad como andenes y ciclovías para el desarrollo de sus actividades. Especialmente estas investigaciones muestran las diferenciales sociales, particularmente asociadas a la desigualdad urbana, desde una perspectiva interseccional entre género y pobreza. En conjunto, estas investigaciones muestran cómo el transporte es una estructura sociotécnica, pero sobre todo cómo es un bien público y cómo es un derecho humano atravesado por identidades urbanas que configuran diferentes niveles de acceso y inequidad social. Daniel, el siguiente, por favor. Daniel.
Tiene un lag.
Siguiente. Gracias. En la segunda sección, que tiene que ver con movilidad activa y el papel de su papel en la accesibilidad local, incluye trabajos de Lex Sagaris, Ignacio Tiznado, Melalira, Luis García y Kim. Estos trabajos son bastante importantes porque es un campo de estudio en crecimiento que busca dar cuenta de la diversidad de movilidad más allá del transporte motorizado y se preocupan por entender la práctica de otros agentes de la movilidad como peatones y ciclistas en términos también de los conflictos que emergen de sus derechos, de su derecho y del uso que ellos hacen de la ciudad. Ellos muestran también la diversidad de respuestas locales para la gestión de la movilidad activa, particularmente a través del análisis de los gobiernos locales, pero también de cómo la sociedad civil construye esas prácticas y construye esas demandas, como por ejemplo los movimientos comunitarios, las ONGs, para reivindicar una ciudad cada vez más incluyente y participativa. Estos estudios muestran el papel importante de las inversiones en los espacios de movilidad que no necesariamente son motorizados y que a través de esas inversiones es posible construir sus ciudades más equitativas, particularmente las inversiones en mejoría de los espacios públicos, no solo en calidad, como en conforto, en comodidad y seguridad, que es una de las variables claves para entender los problemas de las diferentes amenazas que los grupos más vulnerables, particularmente las mujeres y los jóvenes, enfrentan en sus prácticas diarias. Sin embargo, este grupo muestra una de las paradojas más importantes que pasa en América Latina y que tiene que ver con el hecho de que si bien nuestras prácticas de movilidad podrían ser clasificadas de sustentables desde la perspectiva de sociedades europeas, por ejemplo, también que tienen que ver con el hecho de cómo enfrentar los cambios climáticos y cómo construir ciudades mucho más eficientes en términos energéticos, también muestran cómo América Latina, esas prácticas de movilidad sustentables, entre comillas, expresan formas de desigualdad y pobreza estructural y que tienen que ver con la debilidad de los servicios urbanos que atienden las demandas de esas comunidades. O sea, que invertir en transporte público, intervenir en espacios públicos y ciclovías es una cuestión de igualdad. Daniela, el tercero, por favor. Next. Daniel. Por último, quiero mostrar en la última sección las contribuciones que tienen que ver con un tema que se recorre a lo largo del libro del problema de la diversidad de identidades, pero que en este capítulo tiene que ver con una serie de grupos emergentes, no porque ellos no habían estado en la ciudad, más porque tanto la academia como las dinámicas, como las prácticas de planeamiento urbano no lo reconocen. Son precisamente agentes que tienen formas de visión, perspectivas, experiencias y racionalidades muy diferentes a este ideal abstracto de persona que se mueve en la ciudad y que las investigaciones aquí tratadas, desarrolladas por Norma Peña y Eneri López, por Ana Marcela Ardila, Marcos Fontura, Bruna Barradas, Laice Haas, Luisa Morena, muestran a partir del análisis, por ejemplo, de las prácticas de niños y niñas, personas con discapacidad y personas que son sometidas a hospitalización psiquiátrica, que gracias a las luchas antimanicomiales han podido comenzar a usar la ciudad de manera expresiva y hacer demandas sobre infraestructuras, servicios y actividades que son necesarias para su integración. Comprender estos grupos de manera clara puede constituir un desafío para los planeadores en el sentido de que si planeamos ciudades para estos grupos podemos incluir a todos los demás. Estos grupos no solamente son importantes en términos de sus vulnerabilidades, sino sobre todo porque ofrecen una diversidad de visiones de mundo, de visiones de la espacialidad, de representaciones que son importantes y deben ser incorporadas en el diseño de las ciudades. Por último, quisiera destacar dos aspectos, fundamentalmente el tema de que, ya Daniel, ya estoy terminando, que fundamentalmente el hecho de que esta publicación muestra cómo las prácticas de movilidad son elementos fundamentales para entender la inequidad urbana, que no puede seguir siendo pensada desde los problemas privados del mercado, de la habitación, y tienen que ser incorporadas desde la perspectiva de los bienes públicos, y la movilidad es uno de los elementos fundamentales. Y también que es una publicación, que es una contribución fundamental para la construcción de políticas, no solo para los académicos, y por eso estoy invitando a todas las personas, tanto del ámbito académico como de los planeadores, para que lean, discutan y debatan con nosotros. Muchas gracias. Daniel, ya, terminó.
Gracias, Ana. Perdona por los lag, que se demora un poquito en responderme el mouse. So with this general overview of the book, let's move into some of the chapters, which, as Anna said, they all belong to the first part of the book and talk about different contexts, reflecting the realities, the diverse realities of transport and equity in Latin American cities. So I would like to invite first Diego to give a presentation about his chapter.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. First, thanks to Daniel, Natalia, and Anna for their great work editing this book. Also, thanks to them and DPU and UCL for inviting me to share this chapter. This chapter describes gender differences in Montevideo through the study of daily mobility. It is co-authored with Daniela de los Santos. Generally, mobility studies do not account for gender differences more than in a superficial way, distinguishing basic travel patterns or mainstream indicators by sex. However, different patterns and mobility behaviors can obscure situations of gender inequity. Next, please. So for our conceptual framework, the starting point is the well-known different mobility patterns. These different mobility patterns may shed light to elucidate urban inequalities between men and women. Socially construct gender roles affect how people relate to urban spaces and structures. They define different patterns in space and time, and these differences are not gender neutral. In this sense, we argue that gender and mobility present a bidirectional relationship, as several authors in the literature argue. Mobility constraints female daily life, and gender roles represent actual barriers to women's mobility. This figure synthesizes the framework here, starting by the structural gender relations. You can't see my button, my mouse arrow. Starting by structural gender relations that entails an equal distribution of pay and unpaid work in the household and socially constructed roles. These structural factors interact with urban space and structures, resulting in care organization. That is also marked by the lack of reconciliations measures by state and market. The families are on their own to care. So care organization translates in activity and schedules patterns that results in gender mobilities. At the same time, gender mobilities may reinforce structural gender relations and thus further inequalities. Next. Our methodology to empirically assess this framework, we believe that for a gender perspective, it is insufficient to consider different travel patterns from a purely mainstream perspective. We do consider some traditional indicators, but we focus on the study of two specific mobility issues well known in the literature. First, care mobility, considered as an aggregated category and not a single purposes that can obscure these very important purposes in terms of gender mobilities. And second, we carry on individual itineraries based on a tour analysis. This is activity-based analysis, but the important fact is that we focus on persons and not trips, and that allows us to observe several dimensions that are unobserved when you only focus on trips. The data source for the chapter is the 2016 Household Mobility Survey applied in the Montevideo metropolitan region. Next. So a couple of pieces of evidence. We don't have enough time to present a lot, but 2 or 3 pieces I think it is interesting to share with you. Here is some analysis of care mobility. What we see in the first figure is the female contribution to care and work-oriented trips by transport mode. The orange bar shows the contribution to care mobility, to care trips, what we can see here is that 6 out of 10 trips are taken by women. But what we can also see here for Montevideo is that when you analyze it by travel mode, trips made in private transport mode are equal in terms of gender. Indeed, female contribution is less than 50%, but the contributions increases significantly when you consider the more complex travel modes, active, walking or cycling, or buses. In that case, around 70% of those trips are taken by women. And that entails much more complex mobility. In the other piece of evidence that we select to share with you, one could argue that these trips are shorter or in terms of distance and time. So here we consider the whole time devoted to care mobility trips. So here you can find the female contribution to the amount of minutes allocated to care-oriented trips. And we also introduce the income variable. What you can see in the orange line in the left part of the figure is the percentage of minutes of minutes contribute, the proportion of minutes contribute of minutes contributed by women to the care mobility. What we can see is that for the poorest sector, women contribute almost 80% of the minutes allocated to care mobility. And what you can see that when you start increasing income level, you have almost equity. It has to do with the availability of private transport modes. And here what we can see is the interaction of two variables, two sources of vulnerability that we have to take into account. Well, in terms of time, it is also important to know that 60% of minutes are contributed by women. Here, I will show just two itineraries that we analyzed with Daniela. In this case, what you can see here is in the horizontal axis, in the vertical axis, sorry, the time of the day. In the horizontal axis, you will find at the bottom the distance from household to an activity. So what you can see here in the left side of the figure are men itinerary, and the right part, the women itinerary. We will just see two very simple ones that they have one trip. In this case, if you see, you start in the household in the night, then you start to travel at around 9 a.m. The horizontal blue line is the travel, and then you have the activity, in this case, work. So the first finding is what we already know, that for men, this itinerary is much more frequent than for women. And you can see a couple of things, additional things. So women leave the household later. They travel less distances, but with longer trips in terms of time, and they return at the same time. Here, what you can see is that there is a pattern of travel mode that makes women to have shorter trips, but they have to devote more time to those trips. We can go further with this, but we can come back during the question. Next, here we see another itinerary that is, instead of work as activities, a care activity. So you leave home, you carry out the activity, this is a care activity, and then you travel and return home. In this case, the differences are wider. First of all, 4% of men has this itinerary versus 8% of women. So here you already find a clear pattern differentiated by gender, but you also find that it is a much more complex mobility. In this case, women travel longer distances for longer times, and they also have to spend more time carrying out the care activity than men. And in this case, in the chapter, we analyze also travel modes distribution, and you can see that men trips are taken by men. Car trips are taken by men more than by women. In this case, these are average times, average travel times, and also average times of departure and of each trip. So in this case, most of the trips are done either early in the morning or in the afternoon, and here you have the average that is more or less the noon, but it's bimodal. Anyway, we can watch a clear pattern here. So this is just part of the empirical evidence that we use. Some final remarks returning to the conceptual framework. The case of Montevideo constitutes empirical evidence in line with literature on gendered mobilities and gender-sensitive urban planning. Gender is a marker in terms of mobility. How is a marker? So it sets specific conditions for urban life and mobility that in turn may be the cause of further inequality. Also, mobility is a valid case for the study of gender relations and inequality. So it should be included among the repertoire of more traditional and maybe more static analytic tools, such as time use surveys. That is a traditional analytic tool for some gender literature. There are vulnerability compounds that enhance gender inequality. Income is a crucial variable. It's a crucial variable for Global South, for Latin America in particular. It is necessary to assess differences between men and women, but also within women. And related to the later, some regional differences may arise. We could ask if hypermobility requirements are more important in global North to set inequalities versus conditions grounded in a broader social inequalities in the Global South. So in that sense, a comparative agenda would really help. This book is a very good starting point. And finally, this data shows that a gender perspective for urban and transport planning is needed. We have to focus on care mobility, we have to focus on persons in activities, and so on and so forth. Average numbers of mainstream indicators obscures part of that inequality. If we show some mainstream indicators divided by sex, classified by sex, they are almost the same. Okay, so that's our contribution to this book launch. Thanks very much for.
Thank you, Diego, and thank you everyone that has spoken so far. For those of you listening to us at the moment, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to pose questions to each of the presenters, and we are going to try to respond to them either live, or the presenters can address directly your questions in the Q&A function by writing. So please make sure you use the chat, you use the Q&A, so we can have a lively discussion where we move along. So with this, we're going to move now to Gabriela's presentation for her chapter.
Thank you, Daniel. My presentation, okay, now let's go. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, the DPU, the UCL. I'm very happy to be here with you today to launch this book with today. I'll be talking about my contribution to the book. It's the chapter about children and urban mobility, care dynamics on family mobility patterns. And I feel so privileged to talk after Diego, since we share so much of the same theoretical background about care mobilities and also relational mobilities. So the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so my background, I come from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. So the results you'll be seeing here are from Belo Horizonte, as Ana mentioned earlier. Just to situate you a bit about how this research emerged, this came from an unfolding really of my master's research, where I was interested in doing a gender analysis of urban mobility's choice criteria. So I wanted to understand how people choose their mobility paths and how this is different, considering possibilities and the criteria between men and women. So I wanted to do a gender analysis. And to do so, I used data from the Origin Destination Survey. It's from 2012, this data. Also, I did some in-depth interviews and affective mapping, but for this specific work, and Daniel, I please ask you for the next slide. We'll be seeing and sharing data from the OD survey. Thank you. Doing the research, I was looking for data concerning travel motivation, means of transportation, the ratio of journeys by trips. So I was also looking into chain mobilities and multitasking related to care work to compare mobilities between men and women. And I was also looking into indicators of immobilities. And this is the information that came to me very early on my research, and that made me really go deep into the impact that children have on family urban mobility patterns. Please, the next slide. Daniel. Thank you. So I'll be sharing some data with you today just to give you a scenario of what the research brings. And the first piece of information I wanted to share is about immobility. So this information, what is it? The way that the OD survey is carried out here in Belo Horizonte is that they knock at your door and they ask you about every journey you had on the day before, only on the day before. And when you're looking at the general data, in our case, we found that roughly 40% of the respondents hadn't left the house the day before. So it made me ask, who were these people and why weren't they moving around the city in such an expressive volume, right? In our context in Belo Horizonte. And what we found out is an expressive presence on this immobility sample, which I called this extract of the data. We found expressive presence of people with disabilities, of elderly population. And in this case, the information I wanted to stress is the very, very dramatic presence of people who were cohabiting with small children. So over a quarter of the subjects that were present on this sample were cohabiting with children under the age of 5. And just so you have a notion of how high and how unreasonable really this amount is, this is 10 times higher than the amount we have of people cohabiting with children under the age of 5 in our general population. So this was the first information I got about how children could impact on family mobility patterns. And this really impressed me. And this was the moment that I told myself that's okay, I need to write a little bit more and dig a little bit more into this theme. Next slide, please. Okay, so talking about motivation and care-related trips. Okay, we have here, as Diego just showed, but we have here a specific piece of information regarding the responsibles for the household. And we just see a huge enlargement of the pattern of inequalities concerning care-related mobilities when we compare to the general population. Here we see that the care-related mobilities performed by women that are responsible for the household almost doubles when compared to men. And we see that work-related trips have a significantly decrease when analyzing and comparing responsibles for the household. Next slide, please. I was also interested in looking at how the mobility of care would change when children aged. So here we have the information about how this care-related mobility increases amongst women until the children they reach the age of 7. So this is really clear in the graph, and then it just decreases a little bit until they reach 17 years old and are more independent. And the care-related mobility amongst men, they fluctuate, they alternate a little bit while the children are aging in the household. And again, this is information about the mobilities of responsibles for the household. A quick commentary here about income and the variable that we're using to analyze class matters really. is that when we analyzed this mobility of care, taking into consideration the schooler background, we, as expected, can see a decrease of this inequality between men and women concerning how much they are engaged into care mobilities while cohabiting with young children. Next slide, please. Okay, another piece of information I wanted to bring is the ratio of trips per journey. So how many trips we are performing along a whole journey. So I was looking to multitasking and chain mobilities. And here I really wanted to stress one information on this table that we can have a lot of different data here, but it's about how relational care mobilities also are. So even though we always have a pattern of a higher ratio of trips per journey amongst women, the most similar amount we have is when we have men and women cohabiting with children under the age of 7. So this is pointing to this relational choice that is being made inside a household, and maybe towards a sharing of care mobilities and care work inside the house. So next slide, please. Okay, so as this is a really short presentation, I just wanted to bring a quick note on the means of transportation. We have quite complex graphs in the book chapter, but what we found is that even though we find a slightly change when analyzing the means of transportation used when we analyze the aging of the children, we see that this variable is much more strongly associated with schooler background and therefore income and sex than with the presence of cohabitant children. So as Diego showed, we also found that men are more frequently engaged into individual motorized means of transportation, and women are more engaged with collective modes and active mode. And as Anna said, this isn't really a matter of sustainability, but really of the vulnerable populations are being pushed towards the public transportation most of the time. So I just wanted to conclude bringing this information into the visibility that we're having here and the visibility that the book brings, that when we analyze how much children impact into the whole family, really, mobility pattern, we can see new shades of inequalities and how when we're talking about children's needs in urban planning and in transport planning, we're also talking about the caregivers' needs, and more frequently into women's need that are performing this kind of work much more frequently than men. So this is really my objective here, to bring this into ability and to put this question more often asked towards ourselves as academics, but also in our dialogues with urban planners and transport planners to build spaces and cities and transport designs that are more accessible to children and also to the people who take care of them and move them around the city. So this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriela. And with that, I wanted to move to the next chapter. Frederick.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to Anna, Natalia, and Danielle for putting this book together with all the fabulous different chapters, and for the organizers of today's event to give us a chance to talk about our research and our contributions. So this chapter, which I co-authored with Yvette Sepulveda, is part of my research project that I started about 5 years ago about female household employees, mobility practices and experiences in Bogota, Colombia. Next, please. And so the research started out from 3 different premises. One is that has been commented already several times, and it's really connecting well to what Diego and Gabriela presented, the very unequal stratified cities in Latin America, and Bogota is a prime example of that, being highly socioeconomically and spatially stratified. Next, please. And in Bogota, there is an official designation of areas of the city. There's a strata system from 1 to 6, with 6 being the wealthiest areas of the city and 1 and 2 being the poorest areas of the city. And so with this map, we can see there's a clear, not only center periphery differentiation, but also a north-south divide. So we have a highly segregated city in this sense. Next, please. The next observation or premise of the research is that, as in many very unequal societies, we have a large number of people who work in informal sectors, and a very large number of women especially work as household employees. And very often they are Afro-Colombians in the Colombian case. They're uneducated, very little education, very often they're rural to urban migrants. So they're in themselves a very vulnerable group, and at the same time they're one of the most mobile groups, because they do have to travel through the city to get to their places of work. Next, please. And the third premise is that we have in Bogota the very famous BRT public transportation bus system, which is called Transmilenio in Bogota, which was and is still presented as being one of the major solutions to transportation problems in countries in the developing world. And it has definitely improved the traffic situation in Bogota. Nonetheless, we still have large traffic issues in the city. And so the research really started as a project. Next, please. Thinking that, well, this is all these different premises come together, but we do not really have much qualitative research on how the largest group of users of public transportation, which is in this graph, you can see the first and second lowest strata, how do they experience, perceive, and use public transportation? There were lots of statistics, the typical urban mobility studies with graphs, etc., but nobody really asked people, how do you feel in public transportation? These groups from the lower ranks of the socioeconomic spectrum. Next, please. And so with that, this is a really qualitative research project trying to talk to female household employees, how they experience, conceive of, and use urban space, how the organization of urban space and mobility infrastructure affects their daily lives, what strategies they employ to use to overcome the spatial and conceptual barriers in the urban context, and how their own practices then in turn impact on the city. Next, please. And so what we did was, first of all, really get in touch with female household employees and see where they live. And of course, they live in the peripheral and poorer neighborhoods of the city, areas that lack amenities and services, which then contributes to them having to be even more mobile to access all these urban services and amenities. These areas, the peripheral areas, suffer from transportation problems, have less lines maybe of the bus running or less frequency, and they have higher levels of insecurity. Of course, these localities are not homogeneous, but there's a stark difference between the places where female household employees tend to live and where they work. And in addition, many women live in substandard, often self-built housings, which offer little comfort and limited space, and often also very limited safety security for their private lives, Next, please. And so this is just a map showing where the women who are featured in the chapter live, all in peripheral areas of Bogota. Next, please. And so what we really wanted to do was show women's stories, very personal reflection from the women, their life histories, why they work in the sector, what are their conditions, where do they live, and how do they experience the space, the urban space and mobility infrastructure. And so these, of course, are pseudonyms. It's one example of a younger woman with 3 children. who's been working as a household employee for 15 years, lives in a peripheral area with all the typical conditions of these peripheral areas in Bogota. Next, please. And so then we ask what are her working conditions. This is a photo of the area where she lives to just show you what kind of conditions or how the characteristics of the area. Next, please. And then we ask what are their daily life and work conditions. And so this woman works from Monday to Saturday in 2 different households in the northeast and north of the city, and she usually needs 1.5 hours to get to work. That means she spends every day 3 hours just on transportation. And so she's a younger woman, she's healthy, she's well. And so the strategies that she employs, for example, and it's quite typical, to overcome the transportation challenges is that she often walks. She walks, instead of going to the closest bus stop, she walks to a different bus stop, which she considers safer, or where she has access to a route that she prefers for commodity, for speed, or for safety as well. Nonetheless, she, as all the women, has suffered from various incidences, sorry, can you go back for a second, of sexual harassment, and has also witnessed violent attacks on her daily trips. Next. And so then what we also do in this research is really try to visualize these trips. And so we make these maps which represent these daily trips of the women. So point A is where she lives, Mireia, and B and C is where she works. And we try to really express or represent how they reflect on this experience. And so this is a citation where she says, one gets squeezed and squeezed all the time on the bus, and they've even knocked me over on the bus. Next, please. Another example is Floralba, again, a woman who originally comes from the countryside. She's a bit older, in her 50s. She has 5 children, is a single mother, which is a very typical case, and has worked as a household employee for all her life. She lives in Ciudad Bolivar, which is one of the poorest and worst in terms of conditions, living spaces in Bogota, in the south of Bogota, which has the highest levels of insecurity and poverty and homicide rates. And this, of course, affects the mobility and transportation situation. There's very limited access to public transportation where she lives. Next, please. Next, please. Yes, so that's just an image of her living neighborhood. Next, please. And so she works in 3 different households from Monday to Friday. She spends 2 hours one way, which means 4 hours every day in transportation. And one of the strategies she employs, and that's almost all the women we talk to do the same, they rise incredibly early. She leaves her house at 4 a.m. to avoid traffic jams. So it's one strategy to just get out as early as possible. However, because of the very unsafe and violent conditions in her neighborhood where she lives, she always needs to be accompanied to get to the bus stop. So that's an additional challenge she has to face, either with family or neighbors. In addition, for her, transportation is incredibly expensive, or quite expensive, because it's so long. She often doesn't make it within the transfer window, or which is a limited time frame, before she would have to pay again for a different type of mode of transportation. Next, please. So this is her map, and so you can see where in A, she lives in the far south of the city, so she really traverses all of Bogota to the places of work, B, C, and D. And so she reflects on the BRT Transmilenio system in Bogota, that she doesn't like it, because that's the quote of our title. She feels like a sardine in a can. She says it's terrible, and on top of everything, you're being robbed. Next, please. And so these are just some more examples or testimonies of women. 2 more I have. Clara, for example. So she says, and that's also very common sentiment among the women, I think a very important message is, she says, the people who are planning and are in charge of transportation planning in the city, they have no idea what the necessities of the people are. Next, please. And the next woman we document in this chapter she comments that she could spend just waiting for the bus all day long. So she kind of complains about the lack of frequency of buses. Next, please. And so these evidences of these women, these experiences of these women, very subjective reflections on the transportation challenges, we put them in a context or analyze in the context of this very disassociated city that Bogota is, with all the different transportation challenges. And it highlights really that transportation, how it is organized today, how the public transportation system works. It's not necessarily with the most vulnerable, most mobile people in mind. Next, please. What is also interesting, what comes to the fore is that, for example, the neighborhoods where the women work, they hardly know. They really get to work and leave as far quick as possible because they lack time, because of the large time they spend in transportation, but also because they don't feel they don't belong there. There's a very strong association of areas of the city connected to a class status. Whereas they feel in the neighborhoods where they live that they're at home because it's theirs, despite the high levels of insecurity. And then related to mobility, their shared grievances are the traffic jams and lack of routes that make their daily trips even longer, the lack of safety in their neighborhoods, which complicate their daily lives and the organization of their daily lives, that they cannot, for example, go alone to the bus in the morning or return from the bus in the evening, and also the insecurity on the bus. And then what we highlight in the chapter is that they talk about their subjective experience of mobility in terms of suffering. They talk about how they suffer waiting for transportation, they suffer long hours of commute, they suffer from being squeezed, abused, and also not being heard. Next, please. And so what we really want to highlight in this chapter is that female household employees feel they have very few options or hardly any agencies as regards their trajectories. They have to accept work where it is. They cannot choose a place to work because it's more convenient in terms of connection, in terms of mobility possibilities. They cannot choose the forms of transportation because they're so limited, and they can also not choose the time when or how to travel, how long to travel. In this sense, mobility here really becomes a mirror of the socioeconomic and spatial segregation of the city. Upper classes have choices regarding mobility. They use the private modes of transportation if public transportation is not available or too congested, whereas women from lower strata really depend on this transportation system. But the way it is planned apparently is much more catering to middle and upper classes in the city. So it's not really catering to the necessities of people from these lower income groups. And in that sense, mobility really becomes a form of social capital. Sorry, could you go back for a second? That distinguishes and at the same time marks the different urban population groups. And what is really important, I think, is that the women in their spare time choose not to be mobile, with all the implications this has for their personal and professional development. Because if you think a city offers all kinds of recourses for personal development, and the women actually withdraw from all these possibilities that they could have if they would be more mobile. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frederic. Very nice presentation. So with this, we finished with the presentation of our chapters. And now I wanted to take 15 minutes to chat with our panelists. And I had 3 prompts to start the conversation. The first one, aside from reactions to the presentation, is based on what you have seen in the book, based on what you have heard today, what do you think are the current priorities for research in urban mobility and social equity in Latin America? And the second is, what ways forward do you see for strengthening the research community in the region around these issues? And for that, I would like to start with Lexa Garis to give us her thoughts about what we have seen today and what is in the book based on these prompts. Lake.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really exciting and stimulating to be here and to be here for this book. And I wanted to start with a small confession. It's the end of summer here. I've been struggling for 2 months to have a few days off. When you invited me, I said, well, as long as it doesn't fall within my days off, I'm fine. And of course, that's exactly what's happened. I'm having a few days off. And so I was thinking to myself, well, give yourself a break, read the introduction and the abstracts, and that's enough, you know, give yourself a break, for heaven's sakes. And I started reading, and it's so engrossing and it's so exciting to see this kind of research, to see it all together. It really made me think about what we're doing in Latin America, how we have dialogues between the global South and the global North, between we who are out in the periphery and those who are in these powerful centers for research and so on. And how, when we really mobilize those kinds of forces, we can really start to open important windows and doors on new ways of reading our world, reading our cities, reading our societies, and making them, remaking them in the face of the kinds of urgent challenges that we're facing today. So really reading through the book, well, I think the presentations give a great taste of what's going on in this book. I think it's very interesting to see how well we've mobilized mixed methodologies, which in transportation are still quite unusual and can even be discouraged by some journal editors and so on. We've mobilized gender here. We've integrated people with psychiatric disabilities, as well as mobility disabilities and other kinds of disabilities, and how much this has really strengthened our understanding of the social role of transport and transportation's role in society. So I think that's it, especially listening to and reading the chapter on like sardines in a can, it really drove home to me the problem and the challenge of why this happens. And the whole book, it gives a very good map of what is happening in terms of transportation, accessibility, social inclusion, discrimination, and all the different kinds of problems and inequalities that come from that. And so it really hit me very hard. Why do these women have no say in transport policies? Why are we not funding advocacy organizations to organize the users of transportation, public transportation in particular? There are lots of cycling organizations, as Bea Meya's chapter illustrates really well, and they're making huge inroads in not only transport planning, but city planning, and we're facing enormous barriers. So it seems to me that this book gives us a beautiful and very powerful foundation of what is happening. And it forces us, it should force us to use these multi-method and multidisciplinary methodologies that we've developed to map these whats, to explore why. And that is where there are mentions of the issue throughout the book, but we haven't really grappled with power. And power, and the way power is distributed in institutions, and above all in planning institutions in Latin America, is fundamentally and radically different from the global North. While transportation and other social issues and World War II played a huge role in democratization of decision-making in the global North, dictatorships in the global South and in Latin America above all froze those processes. They eliminated a lot of social learning, as did armed conflicts and other kinds of conflicts. So we really need to look much more closely at the why. We've got the whats, we've got the methodologies to look at how this has happened, but we really need to look at the why and how we can change that. And I'll just finish because I'm sure time is always a little short, but the last thing I wanted to emphasize is how exciting it is that Interlink exists, that Movisal, which is a similar network, English-based network for health and transport in Latin America, how important it is that we're no longer just meeting to talk about, we're talking to each other. And our research, particularly with this kind of book, is talking much more to each other and going into much more depth. We should be quoting each other more, we should be questioning each other more, But also we should be very excited because what I see here is a whole new way of theorizing practice and practicing theories about transportation and health and gender and inclusion. And it's going to come from Latin America because as Avritzer and other students of democracy teach us, John Gaventa, Cornwell, and others as well, Evelyn Davignino in Brazil, is that Latin America is democratizing in a different period and in a different way from the post-World War II democracies. And that is huge, not only for Latin America, but also for Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world. So thank you very much for the book and for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Lake. We see a lot of activity in the Q&A, so I wanted to invite all our panelists to have a look at the Q&A and respond in writing. If possible, there is a nice debate going on there. Julio, I wanted to invite you now to speak about the two prompts. So let's think about what's the current priorities for research on urban mobility and social equity in the region and the ways forward. And I think Lake has paved the road for a very interesting build-up in terms of how can we increase the reach of our community of research and practice in transport planning and in transport studies in general, because it's not just about planning, as it was clear in the presentations and in the comments, but we need to have a more socially nuanced perception of all of these issues. So Julio, we hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all for the invitation, and congratulations on a fantastic book. It really is, and I agree entirely with Lake and with Anna's initial perception. It's a fantastic book, which shows it's a bit of a dream come true in many ways, because I trained as a civil engineer, moved on to planning and did my PhD in urban economics. And that transition between disciplines is what is needed to understand the complexity of cities. And Lake has put her finger on an important issue, which is power. So we need to work with across disciplines, with political scientists, engineers, and increasingly, as I'm trying to do now, is work with medics and public health people, because what the book shows, and we had some very powerful stories from Friederike and from Gabriela and everybody else there, is that transport is so central to cities. And Latin America, it's not surprising that a book like this comes out of Latin America rather than other regions. And that is to do with a number of factors. One is the degree of urbanization in Latin America, which is higher than any other region, including Europe. Cities, particularly large cities, dominate in places like Chile. Santiago dominates the country completely, less so in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, which is a little more better distributed in some ways. But also there's been a process of democratization, which I think Lake showed, and that places the onus on local governments to guide basic services and important services which are central to people's lives, but also central to well-being and central to the future of cities, like transport, but other bits of infrastructure in the local government or regional governments. As countries will continue to urbanize, and particularly middle-sized or medium-sized cities will continue to grow, then it is important to think of the local government as the vehicle through which these basic services, crucial services for people's lives that we've seen today, what role they can play in welfare, well-being, reducing inequalities. So that my call for priorities is, let's continue doing this. Let's continue working across disciplines, and let's not this be dominated by middle-aged or old transport engineers like myself. I mean, I've been working across disciplines for a long time, and I think that is the way forward. It's difficult, and it's difficult for us academics because we're not easily slotted into one neat category for the purpose of being assessed or promotion. And it's our issue, or it's our duty to actually persuade the people who evaluate our work to say, look, it's much better, much more strong, and much more powerful to work across disciplines, if provided we can actually break down the barriers, epistemological barriers between disciplines. I've been working for some time, as I said, on health and cities, and I've been working with epidemiologists, but also a number of biologists, another number of people, and the epistemologies are very, very different. And I tell you, we should not underestimate the difficulties of working across disciplines. An anthropologist like Friederike, I think you are an anthropologist, Friederike, and an engineer. I mean, let's speak the same language. It's difficult because we have to keep within our disciplines. So that dialogue across disciplines is important. The other thing I wanted to say was the issue which wasn't mentioned today, which is the issue of COVID and the future of cities. And in the global north, in the rich countries, there's a lot of paranoia, particularly in a city like London, where I am now, about the future of cities. Is this the death of cities? I don't think it is. Yes, it has shown that people like us can work from home, but that's a tiny, tiny percentage of the population, as Friederike's very powerful stories have shown. If I may, Daniel, if you indulge me, give me a second, I'll show you. Look at the percentage of people who are likely to work from home. I don't know whether this is taking a little long, but the potential share of time spent working from home. If you look at even of this sample, the UK, only between 33 and 46% of people can actually work from home, according to a study by McKinsey. You can doubt the methodology, but work from home without losing effectiveness. The theoretical maximum is 46. Look at the bars on the right. You know, if you look at this, sorry, I don't want to turn this into a lecture, but look at the emerging economies, Mexico, China, and India. You know, and the percentage of people who can actually work from home who cannot lose without losing effectiveness is tiny. 18, 26 max, 12 to 16 max. The same goes for people who express a desire to work from home. Again, in Germany, the maximum that people can work for a day or so is 57. So, and then only 5% of people can actually work 3 to 5 days from home in India, and 15% in China, Mexico, and 11% in China. So with these figures, you know, the issue is how do we project the future of cities and start to disentangle this narrative that's coming from the north and the very powerful international media that this is the end of cities. It's not the end of cities. The cities are made up of the flesh and bones of the people that Friederike described and that Gabriela described and that Diego described. This is the bulk of the cities. This is 70, 80% or 60% of the population. And these are the people we ought to be planning for, not the 14% who use the cars. And in that sense, I think Latin American cities, particularly the large and more powerful ones, and Bogota has shown the way in many ways, you have to control that very powerful, influential lobby and actually start thinking seriously about the sort of stories that your colleagues have actually shown us. So congratulations on a fantastic book. It's really a very, very important contribution. Thank you all.
Thank you. Just to close the event, and thank you all that have remained with us for this discussion. I wanted to give a space for Natalia, one of the co-editors of the book, to give us her perceptions about the two prompts and to talk us about her perspectives. How can we continue increasing this community of research and practice? I think Lake's nod to Movisal, to Interlink, and I see Karen Lucas is with us. She's the director of Interlink, and she's been very active in the Q&A. I think it's important that we keep finding these spaces, keep finding these networks and these ways to collaborate. And very importantly, and I think that's something to bring out from Anna's overview of the book, is that we need more young researchers, more early career academics, and to create these spaces so new voices can be heard. So Natalia, all yours. You're on mute.
Yes, sorry, I just realized that. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all. Thank you, Daniel, for this. Thank you, DPU, for having this space for us. And thank you to all the authors. It was a really great opportunity to work with you all. I would like to just say that this book was a challenge for us, I think, but it was really interesting to start seeing how different researchers from different cities in Latin America start like pointing out the things that were like all the time about how we can actually start thinking about inequality in a different way. And I think that this book actually help us think how mobility can be seen as a proxy to inequality. And if we understand mobilities, then we are going to start like thinking how to like change those patterns. So that's the first thing I wanted to like thank the authors, because I mean all the editing of the book made me realize that really mobility is not only how important it is for the city to function, but it's how important it is for the way cities live, the way cities experience. And to change those experiences, as Frederick was pointing out, we need to understand how people approach this experience. I think that not only the first part in which we talk about accessibility and how it could be like a study from a different perspective that is not only like travel patterns, and then we move to active mobility, in which I really appreciate a chapter that Lake and Ignacio presented, because they point out how today's notion of sustainable mobility or active mobility tend to be unquestioned, or is not questioning like some patterns of inequality, as Lake pointed out before. There are organizations for bikers. There are a lot of people mobilizing active mobility, but there are people that is not being, it's just invisible. It's not that they are not moving, it's that we are not looking at the ways they are moving. And I think that's what the last part of the book is showing us, is all these groups of people that move, but we just don't see, we don't study how they move, what happened with children, what is happening with elderly, what is happening with people with disabilities or people that has mental issues. And now on top of that, what Julio was just talking about, what is happening with people that it has to stay home because of COVID, or people that cannot stay home, even though they were supposed to be like quarantine or lockdown. So I think that I will say that what I love about this book and what I think is a really important contribution is because it's really telling us, look beyond just pattern of mobilities, look beyond functionality, and just look at the experience of people and look at diversity in a wider way. There is much more diversity than what we are looking at right now. And this is also a matter of race that, for instance, we don't point out a lot in Latin America. We don't study that a lot. But looking at the chapter of Latinos in US, it's clear that there is an issue with race that also impacting the way people move. So I will say that this book helps us to look motivations, to look at experiences, to look at the way people move in the city beyond function. And this should be important not only for further research, but I think we should make a step forward and start thinking on policy making. As Lake pointed out, if we don't move this dialogue to policy, then there's not going to have the same impact for the people that is actually being experiencing this way. And finally, I will say that one point that this book made clear, it's the notion of immobility, that I think it has to start being researched or studied in a dialogue with the notion of mobility. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Natalia. And before we bring this to a close, I just wanted to acknowledge that everyone listening at the moment is part of our community of research and our community of practice, and that many of the names of friends that have come up in the participants list as I was going through is something that is very encouraging to find and to see that the people that have been working on these issues for a long time and those that are coming now into developing an interest for urban mobility and equity and Latin America as a setting for study. You are the ones that are bringing these things forward, and is that the motivation that we have for trying to produce this type of works. Just to close, and I will take 1 minute, please. Let's be strict with the time. 1 minute from each of the speakers, including the panelists and the presenters, to say your final thoughts about the book, and then we can draw the event to a close. So I'm going to start with the order that I have you on my screen. So Gabriela, what would you like to add before we close the event?
Thank you, Daniel. I'm just fulfilled to be here and to listen Natalia and the other mediators stress the need to transform this into public policies, and understanding that this is the way to access really what we need to make a more equality space and more equality cities. So this is just what I'm feeling right now, and also picking a little bit from Julio's, I'm sorry, never know how to pronounce the names in such an international environment. But picking up a little bit about what you said concerning interdisciplinarity, I wanted really to make an invitation to researchers to explore different epistemologies and go into different departments. This is a path I've done. I come from social psychology, and I have learned so much about urban mobility criteria, looking into emotions and dialoguing a lot with what Frederick brings concerning experience. So this has been a very enriching path until now, and sometimes we feel that it lacks invitation and a little bit of courage. So for the researchers that are early stages researchers like myself that are listening, this is a movement that it's so worth it that I wanted to stress the invitation. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriela. Diego, any final comments? You're on mute.
Okay. Well, once again, to thank you, Daniel, Natalia, and Anna for the great work. I think it's very important to point out the need of a global South perspective. This is a different one. We are in front of different type of problems. I think I agree with Lake. We have a different political economy and power logic in Latin America, and sometimes that makes the difference for these issues. And I think this is a very good example of the need to go beyond observed mobility and it is also a very good sample that it is not always necessary to have new data or to have new information. Sometimes we need a different perspective on the same information we have collected for several decades. What we didn't see it from there is no right or wrong from this point of view that will complement and have an enhanced view of a very complex phenomenon. So thank you again, and thanks for all of you.
Thank you, Diego. Lake, one final thought.
There it is. Okay. Well, totally agree with what everybody has been saying and reflecting. What I would say is that apart from looking at why this happens, we also need to look much more closely at how to change it. Participatory action research and other action research methodologies were originally developed in Latin America during the 60s and were virtually eliminated from our research agendas and capabilities during the dictatorships, particularly in Chile, but elsewhere as well. And I think we need to really bring them back. This is their roots. This is where we're needed to not just theorize about how to change this, but how to actually achieve it. And therefore, I think we really need to dialogue much more directly with our bodies and our hearts, as well as our minds, with society. We need to bring land use into this much more. We have to stop thinking that the only solution for those women in Bogota or Santiago or elsewhere is to make the transport system more rapid. We have to start thinking about integration of their kinds of housing into the areas where they work. And that requires also the opposite. So we need new readings of gentrification. If we just say everything's gentrification and it's all bad, then we're never going to have the kinds of mixed communities that we need for health and civic responsibility and so on. And the last word I wanted to celebrate is playability as an indicator of urban quality. I thought that chapter on children's relationships and how important, I do a lot of work with children and cool routes from schools to neighborhoods under COVID, et cetera, but I really thought that chapter is a huge, very original contribution in an area that has developed very quickly over recent years. So again, it really emphasizing the dialogue with society and the sharing of power as researchers and hopefully shapers of policy seems to me incredibly central to what we do. And the last thing, dialogue among different ages of researchers, because yeah, it's great to work with young people and it's really important. I love it. It's the best thing that's happened at PUC in the last year or two is all these new young researchers. But we have a responsibility to share historical perspective and where we've come from. And when we put that all together, we're much stronger as a research community. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, Lake. Frederick, one final thought. We're coming down quickly to the 30 seconds rather than 1 minute.
Thank you. And not to repeat everything that has been said previously, in which I completely agree with, I want to pick up what Julio said. Right now, we are talking about the pandemic and how cities have to adjust to the situation of the pandemic. And I actually think even though the book was published before the pandemic, it's the baseline. If we read all this research, that's where we have to put our focus on, because that's the problems. And they haven't changed with the pandemic. So I think it's very important in this sense too. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Frederick. Natalia.
Just to thank you all. I think as we need to focus on the why, but also on the how we change it. And that's, again, I will look at the policy making. And let's look at the mobile people, but also the one that cannot move for some reason, or they are limited in their mobility because they're also actors in the city. And I think it's super important to look at them.
Thanks, Natalia. Julio.
Quick one. I think 2 words: translation and interpretation. And this is not only a tribute and a thank you to the very able interpreters. I was listening to all the 3 channels and they're fantastic. So congratulations and thank you to them. But also translation in the sense of making this accessible to people. We live in an academic world which is dominated by the Anglo-Saxon world and by English. And you know, there is a premium in publishing in English, in English language journals everywhere, even in China. And it's a shame. It's a shame because it means this dialogue doesn't really take place across the global south. So, you know, how many of these publications and articles are you going to publish in French, for example, or in Thai, or in Mandarin, or in Chinese, rather? So, you know, to what extent is there, or, you know, will this be translated into English and into Spanish and Portuguese, for example? So the issue of translation to make this accessible is important, but also the translation in the sense of making this digestible to policymakers. Because politicians cannot read long, complex papers. They need bullet points. So it goes back to the issue that several of you have raised, which is the issue of policymaking. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks. And speaking about translation and interpretation, I wanted Ana to close in Spanish and Portuguese for 2 seconds. Just give us your comments in our languages. Ana.
Bueno, muchas gracias a DPU por la invitación, y creemos que este es un momento muy importante para todos, para compartir conocimiento y sobre todo para poder discutir desde diferentes perspectivas. Creo que este libro es exactamente eso, un debate, y un debate abierto, un debate que busca mayor equidad en América Latina. Y los invitamos a comprar el libro, que ustedes encuentran el link en el chat, que esperemos que también sea accesible para ustedes economicamente hablando, que es um pouco caro, pero creemos que é importante. Bom, eu quero convidar vocês a comprar o livro. Eu acho que é uma excelente oportunidade para vocês entender a possibilidade de construir um debate entre diferentes perspectivas, diferentes gerações, diferentes formas de veracidade, diferentes grupos. Então, é um importante momento para nós, essa publicação do livro, e queremos que o livro não seja só um momento, seja, na verdade, um processo contínuo de construção coletiva entre todos nós. Obrigada por tudo.
Thank you, everyone, and that brings to a close our event. Thank you for everyone that had the patience to stay with us until the very end. The recording is going to be available in the DPU channels and the Interlink networks, so you're going to have available for sharing widely. I wanted to thank again to all the panelists, to all the authors and the contributors to the book, and to everyone that listened to us today. This was a fantastic opportunity for us, and we hope that this brings further work. So thank you, and we'll see you soon.